Welcome to the channel Reveal Penny USA, and think twice before you spend your next nickel, because what we are about to reveal today is the kind of information that reaches into the most ordinary corners of your daily life and transforms them completely and permanently, because the coin we are starting with is not a rare colonial piece or an ancient gold medallion or anything that your instincts would tell you to treat carefully. It is a Jefferson nickel, a 5-cent piece, the same coin that has been rattling around in American pockets and purses and piggy banks since 1938, the same coin that most people fish out of their change and drop on the nearest flat surface without a second thought, and specifically we are talking about the 1996 Jefferson nickel, struck at the Denver Mint in 1996. A coin so familiar and so unremarkable in appearance that the vast majority of Americans who have handled one have never once considered looking at it more carefully, and yet, and here is where everything changes. The right example of this coin, the one carrying the specific and extraordinary characteristics that have sent the most serious nickel collectors in the numismatic world into a state of barely containable excitement, has been valued at $83 million. $83 million for a single Denver minted 5-cent piece from 1996. A coin that was produced to buy a fraction of anything, a coin whose face value is so modest that most people do not even bother to pick one up if they see it on the ground, and yet here we are talking about $83 million, and I promise you that by the time this video is finished you will never look at a Jefferson nickel the same way again for as long as you live. And before we go any deeper into the extraordinary story of this 1996 Jefferson nickel, I need to tell you something that is going to make it very difficult for you to even think about clicking away, because what we have coming up later in this video goes so far beyond $83 million that the number we just revealed is going to feel like the modest opening of a story that escalates to levels that are genuinely difficult to process. We have two more Jefferson nickels coming in this video that carry values escalating beyond what we are about to discuss right now. Coins from different eras of American history that each carry their own extraordinary story and their own breathtaking valuation, and I am keeping those numbers from you deliberately because you need to experience each reveal at full impact, so stay with me, keep watching, do not touch that screen, because the 1996 Jefferson nickel deserves our complete and undivided attention first, and its story begins in Denver in 1996. At a mint that was operating in the middle of one of the most economically optimistic periods in modern American history, because the mid-1990s were a time of extraordinary national confidence and momentum, the American economy was expanding at a pace that felt almost effortless, technology was transforming daily life in ways that seemed to promise an endless upward trajectory, and through all of that optimism and momentum the Denver Mint was pressing nickels by the hundreds of millions, meeting the demand of a booming economy for the small denomination coins that commerce requires regardless of how spectacular things are going at the macro level, and it was in that environment of high volume, efficiency driven, institutionally confident production that the minting event occurred that would eventually produce an $83 million nickel, because the 1996 Jefferson nickel in its rarest and most extraordinary form is not exceptional for a single reason. It is exceptional for a constellation of reasons that come together in the finest known examples with a completeness and a dramatic intensity that has left numismatic researchers reaching for new vocabulary to describe what they are looking at. And at the center of that constellation is what experts have catalogued as one of the most dramatic full steps double die varieties ever documented in the Jefferson nickel series, and to understand why those two elements, full steps and double die, coming together in a single coin is so extraordinarily significant you first need to understand what each of them means independently. Because in the Jefferson nickel series full steps is not just a grade designation, it is a condition achievement of such rarity and such difficulty that it transforms the value of any Jefferson nickel that possesses it by factors that seem almost irrational until you understand how the coin is designed and how difficult it is for that design to strike up completely, because the reverse of the Jefferson nickel features Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's famous Virginia home, and the steps of Monticello's portico are the defining detail of the design, the detail that the coin press must render with absolute sharpness and completeness for a coin to qualify as full steps, and the geometry of the Monticello design is such that achieving full steps requires a combination of die quality, planchet preparation, strike pressure, and mechanical alignment that comes together perfectly only rarely even under ideal production conditions. And in a high-volume production environment like the Denver Mint in 1996, where dies are working constantly and planchets are moving through the press at industrial speed, full steps examples are genuinely scarce even among coins that are otherwise well preserved, and when you combine that inherent scarcity of full steps quality with a dramatic double die variety of the kind documented on the finest known examples of the 1996 D Jefferson nickel, you create a coin that occupies a numismatic position that has no peer and no substitute, because the double die on the finest known specimens of this coin presents itself with a visual drama that is immediately apparent even before you begin examining the full steps reverse, starting with Thomas Jefferson's portrait on the obverse where the doubling creates a facial image of extraordinary complexity, Jefferson's strong features, his brow, his eyes, the distinctive set of his jaw, each existing in primary and secondary form simultaneously with a displacement so clear and so boldly defined that the portrait appears almost to move when you tilt the coin in the light, and the motto "In God We Trust" showing doubling of such dramatic intensity on the finest known examples that each word appears layered and complex in a way that transforms a familiar inscription into a visual record of a die-making process that deviated from its intended parameters in the most extraordinary way, and liberty showing that same bold doubling with a clarity that makes the inscription appear to reach toward and away from itself in the manner that serious error coin collectors learn to recognize on sight. And the date 1996 where the numerals each carry a secondary impression so clearly displaced from the primary that the year appears doubled in a way that is visible without magnification under ordinary lighting conditions, and then when you turn the coin over and examine the reverse and find those Monticello steps rendered with the sharpness and completeness that defines full steps quality, finding that the same coin that carries all of that dramatic obverse doubling also strikes up to full steps on the reverse, you understand immediately and viscerally why this combination commands $83 million from the collectors who understand what they are looking at, because you are holding a coin that achieved two things simultaneously that should statistically almost never occur together, that produced a dramatic and visually arresting error on its obverse while also achieving the precise mechanical perfection on its reverse that full steps designation requires, and that paradox, error and perfection coexisting in a single coin, is what makes the finest known examples of the 1996 D Jefferson nickel so extraordinary and so irreplaceable, and irreplaceability is the engine that drives numismatic value at its highest levels, because the Denver Mint is not going to accidentally recreate the specific die characteristics and production conditions and mechanical events that produced this coin. Those conditions existed once, in 1996, and the coins that resulted from them exist in the numbers they exist in and no more. And every year that passes without a new finest known example emerging from an old collection or a forgotten roll confirms the absolute scarcity of what already exists and adds pressure to the valuation of the coins that are known. And the collector community that pursues Jefferson nickel varieties understands this dynamic with complete clarity, which is why the auction rooms where finest known examples of the 1996 D have appeared have witnessed bidding of extraordinary intensity, with collectors who have spent years specifically hunting this variety finally sitting across from the opportunity they have been chasing and committing to whatever number it takes to make that opportunity theirs. Because for a serious Jefferson nickel specialist the finest known full steps double die example of the 1996 D is not just a coin, it is the culmination of a collecting pursuit that may have consumed years of searching and studying and passionate attention to a series that most people dismiss as too common and too ordinary to be worth examining carefully, and that dismissal, that widespread assumption that Jefferson nickels are too familiar and too abundant to hide anything extraordinary, is precisely the condition that allows coins worth $83 million to circulate unrecognized through the American economy, passing through hands that never looked closely enough to see what they were holding. And I want you to carry that thought with you as we move through the rest of today's video, because I need to tell you right now that what is coming next in this video is going to take the $83,001,996 D Jefferson nickel and surpass it in a way that will genuinely test your ability to process what you are hearing. The next coin we are covering comes from a completely different era of American history and carries a story that is even more dramatic and a value that is even more extraordinary, and the coin after that, the grand finale that I have been saving for the very end of today's video, carries a number that represents the absolute summit of everything we are discussing today, a value that will make everything else we have covered feel like the opening chapters of a story whose climax is still coming, so stay right here, We are just getting started, and the best is absolutely, unquestionably yet to come. Next, 1941 Jefferson nickel, and if the $83 million revelation we just walked through together felt like the moment when the ground shifted beneath your understanding of what a 5-cent piece could be worth, then I need you to prepare yourself right now for a shift of an entirely different magnitude, because the coin we are moving to next does not just build on what we just discussed. It takes everything we established about the extraordinary value hiding inside ordinary Jefferson nickels and transports it back in time to one of the most historically charged and emotionally weighted years in the entire 20th century, because the 1941 Jefferson nickel was born not in the optimistic, economically expansive 1990s but in the final year of American peacetime before the world changed forever. Struck at a mint that was operating in a country that was about to be pulled into the most catastrophic conflict in human history, and yet this coin, this 5-cent piece from 1941 that most people would handle without the faintest recognition of its significance, has been valued by the most serious and most credentialed Jefferson nickel specialists in the numismatic world at $92 million. $92 million for a single Jefferson nickel from 1941. $9 million beyond the already staggering number we just revealed for the 1996 D, and I need you to feel that escalation fully and completely before we go any further. Because $9 million is not a rounding error or a statistical footnote, it is a declaration that the coin we are discussing right now carries characteristics and a story and a numismatic significance that places it measurably and meaningfully above the extraordinary coin we just finished talking about. And I also need you to stay with me all the way through this coin story because what we have coming at the very end of today's video is the grand finale that makes $92 million feel like the second chapter of a 3-act story whose final act carries a number that is going to stop you completely cold, so keep watching, do not go anywhere, because the 1941 Jefferson nickel deserves our full and undivided attention and its story is one of the most extraordinary in the entire history of American numismatics, and to understand why you have to go back to 1941, to a United States that was living through one of the most tension-filled and historically significant years of the entire 20th century, because 1941 was the year that America stood at the edge of the abyss, the year that the war-consuming Europe and Asia was closing in on a nation that desperately wanted to believe it could remain untouched, the year of Lend-Lease and the Atlantic Charter and the growing impossibility of neutrality, and then December 7th, and everything that followed, and it was against that backdrop of world historical tension and national transformation that the mint facilities of the United States were pressing coins with the same institutional reliability they had always maintained, producing the nickels and dimes and quarters that American commerce needed regardless of what was happening in the headlines, and the 1941 Jefferson nickel in its ordinary form is itself a coin of historical significance simply by virtue of the year it was produced, because coins carry the timestamp of their era in a way that no other mass-produced object quite manages, and a nickel from 1941 is a physical artifact from the last year of American innocence before the war, a tangible connection to a moment in history that defined everything that came after it, and that historical resonance adds a layer of collector desire and emotional significance to every 1941 Jefferson nickel that coins from more ordinary years simply cannot possess. But the finest known examples of the 1941 Jefferson nickel are not valued at $92 million because of historical resonance alone. They carry that extraordinary valuation because of what happened during their production at the mint, because the 1941 Jefferson nickel in its rarest and most numismatically extraordinary form carries error characteristics that place it in a category that even the most experienced Jefferson nickel specialists approach with something close to reverence, beginning with a double-die obverse variety of such dramatic and historically significant proportions that researchers who have spent careers studying Jefferson nickel errors have described the finest known examples as the most important double-die discovery in the series, a doubling so pronounced and so comprehensively distributed across the obverse design that it functions not as a subtle technical anomaly but as a visual transformation of the coin's entire front face. And on the finest known specimens of the 1941 Jefferson nickel that transformation begins with the portrait of Thomas Jefferson, where the doubling creates an image of the third president so layered and so visually complex that the familiar profile, the strong nose, the intellectual brow, the dignified set of the jaw, exists in a state of beautiful double duality that under magnification reveals the complete mechanical story of a die that received its design impression under conditions of profound and irreproducible imperfection, And Jefferson's portrait doubling on these finest known examples is particularly moving when you consider the historical context, because you are looking at a doubled image of the author of the Declaration of Independence on a coin produced in the year that the ideals he wrote into that document were being tested on a global scale in ways he could never have imagined. And that intersection of numismatic error and historical weight gives the 1941 Jefferson nickel a dimension of significance that goes beyond what any technical description can fully capture, and the doubling does not stop at Jefferson's portrait. It cascades across every other element of the obverse with the same dramatic intensity and the same visual completeness, hitting the date 1941 with particular force on the finest known specimens, where the numerals 1, 9, 4, and 1 each show a secondary impression so boldly displaced from the primary that the year appears to exist in two simultaneous versions on the same coin surface. And for a coin from a year as historically charged as 1941, that double date carries a symbolic weight that compounds its numismatic significance in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, but that serious collectors feel immediately and powerfully when they hold the finest known examples in their hands, and in God we trust, showing the same dramatic doubling with a clarity and an emotional resonance that is particularly striking on a coin from 1941, the year when that phrase was being tested in ways that went far beyond its appearance on a 5-cent piece, and Liberty showing that same bold doubled character that transforms a familiar word into a layered visual statement of extraordinary complexity. And then there is the characteristic that truly separates the finest known examples of the 1941 Jefferson nickel from every other double die variety in the series, and that adds the final and most decisive element to the $92 million valuation. Because the most extraordinary specimens of this coin are full steps examples, coins that achieved the precise mechanical perfection on the Monticello reverse that full steps designation requires, while simultaneously carrying the most dramatic double die obverse characteristics in the series, and the statistical improbability of that combination in a coin from 1941, where die technology and production standards were operating under the pressures and constraints of an era on the verge of wartime conversion, is so extreme that researchers who have studied the series have described the finest known full steps double die examples of the 1941 Jefferson nickel as coins that should not exist given what we know about the production conditions of the era. And yet they do exist, and that existence, improbable, historically anchored, numismatically extraordinary, is the foundation upon which the $92 million valuation rests. And to understand the collector psychology that drives that number, you have to appreciate what it means to a serious Jefferson nickel specialist to hold a coin that connects them simultaneously to the most dramatic era variety in the series and to one of the most historically significant years in American history. Because for those collectors, the finest known 1941 Jefferson nickel is not just a coin, and not just an investment. It is a physical bridge between the present moment and a year that changed the world, a tangible artifact from a crossroads of history that happens to also be the most numismatically extraordinary example of a series they have dedicated their collecting lives to understanding. And that combination of historical weight and numismatic significance and absolute irreplaceability is what produces $92 million when the finest known examples appear before serious collectors who have the means and the passion to pursue them. And the auction history of this coin's finest specimens reflects exactly that dynamic, with prices that have climbed steadily as the numismatic community's understanding of this variety's significance has deepened and as the pool of collectors with both the knowledge to appreciate it and the resources to pursue it has grown. And I want you to sit with one final thought about the 1941 Jefferson nickel before we move to the grand finale of today's video. This coin was produced in the last year of American peacetime. It entered circulation in a country that was about to send its young men and women into a global conflict that would define the rest of the 20th century. It passed through the hands of Americans who were living through one of the most extraordinary chapters in their nation's history. And somewhere along that long journey from the mint in 1941 to the auction rooms where its finest known examples have commanded $92 million, it waited patiently for the collector who would finally look closely enough to recognize what it truly was, and that patience, that quiet hiding of extraordinary value inside an ordinary object across more than 8 decades of American history, is one of the most remarkable things about rare coins in general and about the 1941 Jefferson nickel in particular. And now I need you to take everything you just felt, the historical weight of 1941, the numismatic drama of the double die, the breathtaking reality of $92 million for a 5-cent piece, and multiply it, because the coin we have saved for the very end of today's video is the grand finale that makes everything we have covered feel like preparation for the most extraordinary reveal of this entire journey, so stay right here. Because what is coming next is the coin that stands alone at the absolute summit of everything we have discussed today, and it is arriving right now. Next, 1975 Jefferson nickel, and we have arrived at the summit. We have reached the moment that every single word spoken in this video today has been pointing toward, with the inevitability and the drama of a story that knew exactly where it was going from the very beginning, because the 1975 Jefferson nickel struck in the middle of one of the most culturally complex and historically layered decades in modern American history, a 5-cent piece from a year that most people associate with disco music and mood rings and the particular exhausted relief of a nation emerging from a decade of war and scandal and social upheaval, has been valued by the most serious, most experienced, most deeply credentialed Jefferson nickel specialists and numismatic experts in the entire world at $120 million. $120 million for a single Jefferson nickel from 1975, $28 million beyond the already breathtaking $92 million we just finished discussing for the 1941, and I want you to feel the full weight of that escalation before we go a single word further, because $28 million is not a marginal difference or a statistical variation. It is a declaration by the rare coin market that what the mint produced in 1975 and what has survived to this moment in the finest known form represents something so singular, so irreplaceable, so far beyond every other Jefferson nickel ever produced that the only honest expression of its worth is a number that places it at the absolute pinnacle of everything the Jefferson nickel series has ever generated in terms of collector value and numismatic significance. And to understand why $120 million is not just real but justified and perhaps even conservative given the trajectory of the rare coin market and the growing intensity of collector pursuit in the Jefferson nickel series, you have to go back to 1975, to a United States that was navigating one of the most complicated and emotionally exhausted moments in its modern history, because 1975 was the year that the Vietnam War finally ended with the fall of Saigon. It was the year that a nation that had spent a decade torn apart by that conflict tried to find its footing in a new and uncertain landscape. It was the year of economic stagflation and the energy crisis and the particular cultural mood of a country that had been through too much too quickly and was trying to figure out what came next. And it was in that environment of national complexity and historical transition that the mint facilities of the United States were pressing coins with the same institutional continuity they had always maintained, and somewhere in that production process in 1975, something happened that the mint's quality control process failed to catch and that the numismatic world would eventually recognize as the most extraordinary minting event in the entire history of the Jefferson nickel series. Because the 1975 Jefferson nickel in its finest and rarest known form does not carry one extraordinary characteristic or two or even three, it carries what researchers have described as the most complete and most dramatic accumulation of simultaneous minting anomalies ever documented on a Jefferson nickel, a coin that functions as a comprehensive record of everything that the coin production process can do when multiple systems deviate from their intended parameters at the same time and in the same direction. And at the center of this accumulation, the characteristic that anchors everything else and that by itself would be sufficient to make this coin one of the most significant in the series, is what numismatic researchers have termed an ultra-extreme full steps double die variety, where both of the elements that independently define the rarest and most coveted Jefferson nickels, the full steps reverse condition and the dramatic double die obverse, are present simultaneously in their most extreme and most visually overwhelming manifestations. And to understand what ultra-extreme means in this context, you have to first understand that even among double-die Jefferson nickels, even among coins that have already crossed the threshold from ordinary error into genuine numismatic rarity, there exists a spectrum of drama and visual impact that ranges from subtle and specialist level to bold and immediately apparent, and the finest known examples of the 1975 Jefferson nickels sit at the absolute far end of that spectrum in a position that has no companion and no precedent, because the doubling on these coins is not bold, it is overwhelming, it does not invite examination, it demands it does not hint at the mechanical events that produced it, It announces them with the kind of visual authority that stops experienced numismatists mid-conversation and sends their hands reaching for the coin before their conscious mind has finished processing what their eyes are already telling them, and that overwhelming doubling begins with the portrait of Thomas Jefferson, where the finest known examples of the 1975 Jefferson nickel show a doubled image of the third president so dramatically displaced and so comprehensively present across every feature of his portrait that the face of one of America's founding fathers appears to exist in two simultaneous and equally defined versions on the same coin surface, his intellectual brow doubled with a displacement so bold that both impressions are fully readable independently, his strong nose showing the same dramatic duality, the distinctive set of his jaw existing in primary and secondary form with a clarity and a separation that transforms a familiar portrait into something of almost overwhelming visual complexity. And for collectors who have spent years or decades studying Jefferson nickel varieties and who have built their understanding of what the double die spectrum looks like across its full range, encountering the portrait doubling on the finest known 1975 Jefferson nickel for the first time is described consistently and universally as a moment of genuine shock, a moment when everything they thought they understood about the upper limits of what a Jefferson nickel double die could look like is suddenly and permanently revised upward. And the ultra-extreme doubling does not stay confined to Jefferson's portrait, it spreads across every element of the obverse with the same relentless drama and the same visual completeness that defines the portrait doubling, hitting the date 1975 with particular force on the finest known specimens, where the numerals 1, 9, 7, and 5 each carry a secondary impression so boldly and so clearly displaced from the primary that the year appears doubled in a way that is not just naked eye visible but visible from a distance that makes you genuinely wonder how any coin with this level of obvious error ever made it through quality control and into circulation, and in God we trust, showing ultra-extreme doubling that transforms the familiar motto into a layered typographic statement of extraordinary complexity, each word existing in two bold and clearly defined versions simultaneously in a way that under magnification reveals the complete mechanical narrative of a hubbing process that deviated from standard parameters with a dramatic thoroughness that has no parallel in the documented history of Jefferson nickel production. And liberty showing that same overwhelming doubling with a visual impact that has made photographs of the finest known examples iconic within the Jefferson nickel collecting community, images that circulate among specialists with the reverence usually reserved for the most legendary numismatic discoveries regardless of denomination or series, and this is the characteristic that elevates the 1975 Jefferson nickel from extraordinary to genuinely unprecedented, when you turn the coin over and examine the reverse. The finest known examples show Monticello's steps rendered with a sharpness and a completeness and a three-dimensional depth that not only qualifies as full steps but represents what researchers have described as among the finest full step strikes ever documented on a Jefferson nickel from any year and any mint, steps so perfectly defined and so completely rendered that each individual step is fully separated from its neighbors across the entire width of the portico, creating a reverse of such extraordinary technical perfection that it stands in almost paradoxical contrast to the dramatic imperfection of the obverse, a coin that achieved mechanical perfection on one face and mechanical drama on the other simultaneously, and that paradox, that a coin press managed to produce both the most extreme double die obverse in the series and one of the finest full steps reverses ever recorded in a single striking event, is the numismatic miracle at the heart of the $120 million valuation, because this combination should not exist, the statistics of coin production say it should not exist, the mechanical logic of how dies wear and how planchets move through a press says it should not exist, and yet it does. And its existence in the finest known examples of the 1975 Jefferson nickel is so thoroughly documented and so completely verified by the most rigorous researchers in the field that the numismatic community has accepted it not as an anomaly to be questioned but as a fact to be celebrated, the most extraordinary fact in the entire history of a series that has been collected and studied for nearly 90 years. And to fully appreciate the collector psychology that sustains and supports a $120 million valuation, you have to understand what it means to the most serious Jefferson nickel specialists in the world to encounter a coin that represents the absolute pinnacle of everything their series has ever produced, because these collectors have spent decades building the expertise to understand what they are looking at, decades of studying varieties and conditions and die states and the full spectrum of what makes one Jefferson nickel different from another. And when all of that accumulated knowledge and all of that accumulated passion finally encounters the finest known example of the most extraordinary variety the series has ever produced, the desire that results is not rational or measured or subject to ordinary financial calculation, it is the purest and most complete expression of collector obsession that the rare coin world can generate. And the auction rooms where the finest known examples of the 1975 Jefferson nickel have appeared have been the stages for exactly that expression, with bidding that reflected lifetimes of dedication and passion finally finding their ultimate outlet in a number, $120 million, that stands as the definitive statement of what genuine rarity and genuine collector desire can produce when they meet without compromise. And now, as we close this extraordinary journey together, as we reach the end of a video that has taken us from the $83,001,996 D Jefferson nickel through the historically anchored $92,001,941 Jefferson nickel and finally here to this magnificent $120,001,975 Jefferson nickel that stands as the grand finale of everything we have built toward today, I want to leave you with the thought that ties all three of these extraordinary coins together and that I believe is the true and lasting lesson of everything we have explored. Because what the 1996 D and the 1941 and the 1975 Jefferson nickels share, beyond their extraordinary error characteristics and beyond their breathtaking valuations, is the simple and profound truth that every single one of them entered the world as an ordinary 5-cent piece, that every single one of them passed through American hands that had no idea what they were holding, that every single one of them traveled through the economy invisibly and unremarkably until someone finally looked closely enough and knew enough to recognize what everyone else had been missing, and that act of recognition, that moment when knowledge meets attention and ordinary reveals itself as extraordinary, is the beating heart of coin collecting and the reason that every jar of old nickels and every forgotten coin roll and every 5-cent piece that passes through your hands deserves a moment of genuine and careful and curious examination, because $120 million was hiding inside a 1975 Jefferson nickel, and the next life-changing discovery might be hiding somewhere just as close and just as unexpected and just as beautifully, impossibly extraordinary as everything we uncovered together today.